Bush, Republican appointee. He recently stated that the department's actions are putting public trust at risk, and that its response in Portland shows that there was no respect for or coordination with the wishes of local authorities. He went on to say, I believe that this is a dangerous precedent to set as our country faces so many threats that require these partnerships. Is former Secretary Chertoff wrong?
So I certainly respect former Secretary Chertoff service to the department and to the country, but absolutely on this point, he is dead wrong.
How is he dead wrong?
Again, I'm happy to walk you through exactly the coordination that we have tried to do with Portland Police. The mayor, I reached out to the mayor on an occasion to offer our support, to offer that coordination, to understand what's occurring on the ground. The events that are occurring, again, between midnight and 5 a.m. every morning. Don't believe that Secretary Chertoff, as well as others that have commented on DHS actions, really understand what is going on in Portland. I think they confuse peaceful protesting that we see usually takes place between 6 and 7 p.m. until about 10:30 at night. Again, no concerns there. It happens right across the street from the courthouse. There are no incidents. What we see at midnight, 5 a.m., violent activity where we get no support from state and local officials.
Well, as a result of what's happened in Portland, I certainly have heard an awful lot from state and local officials in my state concerned as well about what they have seen. And given the understandable concern that's being expressed following the images that we've seen, what are you doing to work with officials and communities that are participating in Operation Legend to build trust and some of the critical relationships that are necessary for us to accomplish the mission that you're discussing?
I would answer that two different ways, Senator. One, what we see in Portland is very different than any other city or country that we see when we talk about protecting federal properties. We see a cooperative relationship between federal, state, and local officials, whether it's Chicago, Seattle, or any other major city where we have federal properties. There's threats and intelligence. Individuals are targeting those facilities. State and local law enforcement partner with us and help respond to that. That's different than what has been occurring in Portland for over 60 days, previously 60
So you're saying Portland's a one-off. Portland's one case. You're not seeing this all across the country. We shouldn't be worried about anarchy and chaos all across the country.
I've been very clear about directed events at federal facilities. Portland is very, very different. Now, we do see targeted attacks in Atlanta and Seattle and other places to federal facilities. They have been damaged. But what we see in those cities is state and local law enforcement partnering with us to protect the facilities, and then, again, to hold those that are attacking those certainly accountable. When we talk about Operation Legend, which you mentioned is a Department of Justice led initiative, that's really to target sort of the violent street crime that you see in some of these major metropolitan areas, transnational criminal gangs, illicit narcotics, firearms, things of that nature. So Department of DHS, they're our Homeland Security investigators, are partnering with the Department of Justice on that, but it is a very different activity than what we are doing in Portland.
Could you, we're running low on time here, but Mr. Wolf, with DHS resources stretched, what assurances can you give us that combating white supremacist violence and domestic terrorism is truly a priority within your department and something that you will commit the resources necessary to combat?
Absolutely. We've had several conversations about this. Again, the department looks at all forms of violent extremism, whether it's the far right, far left, and everything in between. Obviously, we're responding specifically to what's going on in Portland and other cities around the country. Again, in a different position at the department, I had the opportunity to develop the department's strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence. That was back in September of 2019. Strategy outlines the dangers that we are seeing, the rising threat that we are seeing of violent white supremacist extremism, and lays out a number of actions. We're working on that implementation plan, I believe you referred to in your opening statement. We're also pushing out additional grants targeting this area as well. We have non-security or nonprofit security grants from FEMA that also goes towards places of worship, faith-based communities that will also protect them against this. And then, of course, our cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency works with a host of partners and stakeholders regarding soft target security and making sure that those are shored up and against violent attacks as well.
So, in closing here, I know that you put out the strategic plan, but what you really need to do is actually implement a plan. A plan is nothing unless it's actually implemented. You have not put out that implementation plan. We don't see a sense of urgency when it comes to creating that plan. What is your timeline? When should we see an implementation plan and actual concrete actions?
Sure. So while we haven't published or put out an implementation plan, we are implementing many of the initiatives in that strategy. Let me get you an exact date on when we can get the implementation plan up. I know it's being finalized as we speak, and we will provide that to the committee as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
Mr. Wolf, first, I'd like you to tell the men and women who work for you, federal law enforcement, that we appreciate what they're doing. We know that they have a responsibility, by the way, under laws that were passed here in this Congress to protect these federal buildings. And looking at those videos is hard. It looks almost like a war scene. And so let them know that, the people I represent understand they have a responsibility, understand that they're putting themselves in danger, and it's appreciated. And just to back up a second, the tragic murder of George Floyd was something I think, all of us thought was horrible. And then we had protests and demonstrations all around the country in response to that, and in support of racial justice and equality. I think the vast majority of Americans fully support those demonstrations. If they're peaceful, and I think we have the right as Americans under the First Amendment to be able to protest, and we can never let that be taken away. But what we saw in those videos and what you explained today and what we've all seen on our TV sets and online is deeply troubling, because the violence, the rioting, the physical damage, the arson, certainly the looting. One thing that breaks my heart is to see store owners, particularly in some of these underserved communities who have worked hard to create a small business, see it destroyed. You can drive through almost every major city in America today and see stores that are boarded up. You can see here in Washington, D.C., by the way, if you drive around the White House area, you'll still see a lot of stores and shops boarded up. The arson that we saw in the videos is extremely dangerous to everybody. And unfortunately, we've seen this accompany some of these peaceful protests, not all. And Portland is an exception, as you said, in terms of the attacks on the federal buildings. I guess the one question I would ask you is, what have you learned? The coordination with the local and the state officials has obviously been a huge problem. Lack of coordination, I should say. Sounds like that's getting better. It sounds like the governor and others are now working more closely with you. But what could you have done better? The protection of the courthouse and federal building in general, I think, is again clearly within your mission set. But were there things that were done or things that happened that you've learned from in terms of potential for future conflicts like this? What would you tell us this morning?
Well, thank you for the question, and I think it goes back to the ranking member's question about the partnership between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement. What we've seen is across the country, it works in city after city after city. Unfortunately, what we saw in Portland was the lack of that, allowed these violent individuals to, again, continue to attack a federal facility night after night with no repercussions, with no one holding them accountable. So they became more emboldened night after night. We started seeing some of the weapons that they used became more and more sophisticated. At first, it was bricks, bottles, frozen water bottles, canned food, things that are hard that can be thrown at an officer. Night after night, 30 days in, 40 days in, there's no consequence to them doing that. So then they come back with commercial grade fireworks. Then they come back with IEDs. Then they come back with power tools. They keep coming back because there's no accountability. So the lesson learned is making sure that there is close partnership with state and local law enforcement officials. Again, we see that in every other city around the country.
Yeah.
We see that now.
Well, I think you make a good point. You don't want to have this accelerate, and so getting control of the situation earlier obviously makes sense. And I won't push you on this because I want to ask you about Operation Legend, but I think my question is more, what have we learned as a federal DHS, Federal Protective Service, law enforcement function that we could have done better? Was there nothing to have been done? Could that information have been provided in a way that was more compelling to be able to get that cooperation? I find it extraordinary that the cooperation wasn't there because I know every level, local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement typically have a passion to be able to coordinate and work together and do it well, even without direction often, just at the grassroots. But maybe you can get back to me on that as to what could have been done to try to make this relationship work better. On Operation Legend, it came up a moment ago, and I'd like to clear up some confusion about that. This has been something that has been confusing in my own state. My understanding is that Operation Legend is a follow-on to Operation Relentless Pursuit, which is about violent crime. It's not about these protests. It's not about what we've been talking about otherwise today. And Cleveland, Ohio is one of the cities that is apparently part of Operation Legend, will receive more funds and also more help, including help from DHS. My understanding is that several DHS personnel will be part of the new Operation Legend, or the expansion of Operation Relentless Pursuit in Cleveland. And I think, the violence that we've seen in our cities, and I'm talking about violent crime here, is a big concern. I mean, we've seen an uptick. The studies I've seen even this week are that there's about a 24% rise since last year in reported homicides in 50 of our largest cities in America. Unfortunately, Cleveland is one of those. And so I think it's good that we're helping Cleveland to cut down on violent crime. I think, having talked to the mayor about this, he also would like to see, obviously, a reduction of violent crime. My concern is that there was some confusion and concern back in Ohio about this program because of a lack of communication with the U.S. Attorney, with the mayor, with others. The mayor told me he read about Operation Legend as an example. He said he's heard about it from a press release. So did I. And my question to you is, what could we do to sort of reduce the confusion about this? There was a lot of concern that this had to do with federal agents coming in and dealing with protests, which was not the issue at all. It was about violent crime. And without having information up front and without having done the proper groundwork, it created more confusion than it should have. I think it's been cleared up now. But I would just ask you, could you distinguish Operation Legend from, as an example, the situation in Portland? And can you tell us how DHS could do a better job in cooperating with local law enforcement, as well as some of our federal personnel, including the U.S. attorneys?
Sure. Again, what we are doing in Portland is protecting a federal facility that has been under attack or was under attack for over 60 days. Operation Legend is not directed at federal facilities or protection of federal facilities. It's more to go again to address that violent street crime. HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, is part of ICE, is partnering. It's a small partnership with DOJ as they go out into different cities. Specifically in Chicago is where we are most engaged. And HSI every day deals with drug trafficking, money laundering, weapons trafficking, and violent crime. And that's what we are partnering with ATF, DEA, FBI, Marshal Service in specific cities like Chicago, but across the country as well. So 2 different missions regarding Operation Legend and making sure that the coordination and the communication is there. It's my understanding that most Operation Legend initiatives are being run by U.S. attorneys in those various cities and various districts. So I'll certainly take that back to DOJ to make sure that partnership and that communication is there.
Well, again, I think I would appreciate your looking into it, but also getting back to us and talking about how we can better coordinate. Because clearly, in Ohio, we didn't coordinate well. And although, again, you don't take the lead in that, it's more of a DOJ responsibility for local law enforcement and for the mayor and for even the U.S. attorney to have heard about it through press accounts rather than having been told about it and having got the explanation makes it more difficult for you to do your job, because when your agents show up and people aren't sure what the purpose is, it makes it harder. So I just think it's a matter of simple communication, and my hope is that we can do a better job of that going forward. And again, I want to end with saying I hope you will communicate back to people, the men and women who work for you, who are doing their jobs and doing it professionally, that we understand the sacrifices they're making and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Ashton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. And I would just echo the Ranking Member's observation that it would be good to build on this hearing by also hearing from state and local officials. I want to thank you, Secretary Wolf, for your Acting Secretary Wolf, for your testimony today. And I also hope you will pass on my thanks to the men and women who work so bravely to defend our country and make us safe. And I also want to take a moment to mourn the loss of David Patrick Underwood, the Federal Protective Service officer who was killed in the line of duty in Oakland by a member of the Boogaloo movement. Our country is undergoing a much-needed reckoning about our history and reality of racial injustice following the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. As we continue working to address long-standing inequities in our society, including in the criminal justice system, we must also conduct strong oversight of the federal government's response in recent months to the protests in places like Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon. That's why today's hearing is so vital. So I want to start, Mr. Wolf, with this question. The Washington Post and Politico recently reported that the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis compiled intelligence reports about journalists and protesters involved in the Portland protests. A second story also stated that Mr. Cuccinelli waived the requirements that DHS's intelligence office be subject to a review by DHS's internal civil rights watchdog, the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. That's extremely troubling. At the core of its mission, DHS relies on public trust and cooperation as embodied by the See Something, Say Something campaign. The American people expect that DHS's activities will be done in a manner consistent with our values, so it is extremely disappointing to hear that DHS's own internal mechanisms are being circumvented or perhaps arbitrarily discarded. As I've heard you say, the matter is being investigated by the department. Can you confirm for us, please, who is leading the investigation?
Sure. In the department, the Office of the Inspector General is performing that investigation. I will say, you mentioned two different issues, I think that are being conflated. So if I have just a moment to explain the situation. So, open source reporting program at DHS has been in existence since 2011. And so there were 3 instances that I was made aware of information being put out that also identified media or press individuals. As soon as I was made aware of what was occurring, I stopped the program, I stopped the practice, referred it to the IG, and again removed the individuals in charge of that directorate.
And let me just stop you there for a minute. My time is limited, and I just want to go down on one thing. Is the IG the only investigation going on of that issue?
Of that specific issue, yes, I believe so. We have an internal. INA has also an oversight function that is also looking at that.
Okay, so then what I want to get to then is, if you have another internal investigation, given his apparent involvement in the waiving of the requirement that the DHS intelligence activities comport with civil rights and civil liberties oversight, will Mr. Cuccinelli recuse himself from any matters related to that investigation?
Again, the OIG investigation is separate and apart from anything that I would be involved in, that Mr. Cuccinelli would be involved in.
But you mentioned an internal investigation somehow separate.
It was a preliminary investigation, but as soon as the IG picked up the investigation or accepted it,
that is now the only one.
we have stopped.
Okay.
So the IG.
All right. So
Now, specifically what, to go back to the CRCL question that you specifically mentioned, I think they're being a little confused here. So we have raw intelligence reporting, and we have finished intelligence products. What Mr. Cuccinelli did was to remove himself. There was an issue with finished intelligence reports. And there was a disagreement between CRCL and the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. It would normally come to the Deputy Secretary to resolve. What he did is he removed himself from that. He left it with the Undersecretary of Intelligence and Analysis to resolve that. The CRCL plays a role with that. CRCL also plays a role regarding collection requirements of raw intelligence as well. I think it's important to separate those things. What we saw in Portland and the open source reporting are raw intelligence products.
All right. Well, thank you. follow up with you on that because I want to drill down and make sure we understand it. But it is a concerning report, and I appreciate the idea of taking it on. I want to move on to something else. As DHS personnel work to protect federal buildings and their occupants, it's critical that they take all possible steps to try to de-escalate any confrontations, both to protect themselves and others. So I want to build a minute on Senator Portman's line of questions about what DHS could have done better. Two of your predecessors at the department, who both served under a Republican administration, have expressed concern that that wasn't what happened in Portland. De-escalation wasn't what happened. Tom Ridge, our nation's first DHS Secretary and former governor of Pennsylvania, said that the way DHS officials were acting was, quote, not diffusing the situation, it exacerbated, close quote. Similarly, former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff recently said that DHS's forces have taken a, quote, very belligerent, aggressive tone, close quote, toward the protests, and that their actions have, quote, poured gasoline on the fire, close quote, of a situation that now threatens to undermine the public's trust in the department. Mr. Wolf, have you spoken with former Secretaries Ridge and Chertoff? Do you agree with them that DHS should seek to de-escalate tensions when in the field instead of increasing them?
I have spoken to both former Secretaries Ridge and Chertoff. I walked them through specifically what was going on in Portland. Mm-hmm. They asked a number of questions,
yep.
And at the end of that conversation, they thanked me. They said they did not know all the facts, right. And that certainly informs their decision moving forward. Absolutely, we absolutely have to de-escalate. A lot of the training at the Federal Protective Service, as well as the specific assets that we sent to Portland, are trained on de-escalation techniques. A lot of what we do, when you look at a 5-hour period every night, we are inside that federal courthouse 90 to 95% of that time. We only come out when there are fires being set, when there's enough individuals, when there's thousands. We've seen anywhere from 500 to 5,000 individuals on that fence line. And at some point, you do have to disperse the crowd. You have to push them back because they will overrun. So we do a number of tactics that actually try to de-escalate the situation.
Well, what I would appreciate, understanding that I'm just about out of time here, what I would appreciate is material from your department about the type of de-escalation training that you do. And I also, to follow up on where Senator Portman was going, would appreciate further conversation about what you've learned about what worked and didn't work. Because we've seen very disturbing video here today. There's also very disturbing video where federal authorities, are using batons on people who appear to be peaceful, right? So those are the types of things that together can escalate along with tactical decisions your forces may make. So I'd appreciate following up with you. Again, thank the professional men and women in your service for their service, and thank their families for us too. Thank you.
Just one clarification, the video that we see with the baton hitting the Navy veteran, yep. That is not DHS law enforcement.
Well, but again, that's why coordination and clarity about what you're doing, who you are, and where clear identification makes a difference. Thank you.
Senator Paul.
Of course, Black lives do matter, but just saying it so doesn't make it so. Slogans painted in the street don't necessarily save lives. It's important to know that the majority of lives being lost in our cities are young black men. I think it's unconscionable. It's been going on decade after decade after decade. I've visited the south side of Chicago. I've been to the most violent precinct in our country. I visited with Pastor Brooks there, who's trying to save lives one at a time through Christ, through counseling, through showing a strong male role model that is acting in a peaceful way. I've been to Ferguson. I was there after the riots. I met with the business owners there who lost their businesses, the majority of whom were African American. Pastor Brooks was recently interviewed, and after the rioting in Chicago, lamented that rioters burned down the local pharmacy, and now people in this community were having to drive 15, 20 miles out into the suburbs to get their prescription drugs. It's unconscionable. It's not an easy problem to fix. People have tried to fix it, but it's going on in our cities, and it's made worse by lawlessness. It's made worse by the mayhem that people have allowed. And there is an inconvenient truth that we have to face, and it's a political one. The inconvenient truth is that all of these cities are run by Democrats and have been for 50 years. Every one of our major cities run by Democrats, governors, mayors, police chiefs, all Democrats. And you could say it's a coincidence, or you could say, well, all of them? If you look at the murder rate, the top 10 cities that have the highest murder rate in our country, every one of the mayors is a Democrat. So we have to get to the bottom of this. And if you live in those cities, we have to figure out some kind of constructive way to make it better. But you have to first realize that the Democrats have failed every one of these cities. And if your city is under attack and you have young children being shot, the chairman mentioned the names of these young children. In Louisville, 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds being shot through windows and doors. Who's running the cities? We have to do something about it. But painting slogans and graffiti and throwing Molotov cocktails isn't getting you anywhere. If you live in Portland, instead of throwing Molotov cocktails, instead of trying to burn the federal courthouse, maybe you should be gathering signatures to have a recall of the mayor who let mayhem and chaos happen in the city. Maybe we should be recalling the mayor of Chicago who's allowed this to go on. It's been going on decade after decade. Black lives do matter. But if they do matter, do something about it. And those who are at the receiving end of this, the young black men who are dying in Chicago, dying in these cities, rise up and say, my goodness, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. Quit electing the people who are allowing your cities to go to rot and ruin, who are allowing the local drugstore to be burned down, who are allowing the businesses to be burned down that will leave the community and never come back. It is a disaster in our country, and people need to let the blame accrue where it will accrue. To the people who've been running these cities for 50 years. With regard to who should do this, my preference is that it be done locally. The Constitution reserves these police powers to the state, and primarily police powers should be exercised in the state. It should be a rare exception that we have federal officers in our states taking care of things even as serious as arson, even as serious as attacks. But I do understand when there is mayhem and chaos, somebody's got to protect the federal buildings. My preference would be that if that has to happen, that they stay at the federal buildings, arresting only those who are committing violence when they commit the violence. And we are aware and careful that allowing federal police and allowing people to federalize police force and send it into our cities, that there are dangers to that. One of the checks and balances of federalism was not to let the executive branch have police, not to have the executive branch in our states. So I think we need to be very wary of the possibility for harm by federalizing police powers, sending them into these situations. And there have been some disasters already. Perhaps not your department, but the images of the young man being shot with a rubber bullet who had his skull fractured and his face fractured and maybe ultimately will be disfigured from this while he was simply holding up a speaker. Those are terrible symbols. And it's hard to be a policeman. The federal authorities haven't necessarily been, I think, steeped in the training that it takes to be able to try to put down violence, but at the same time not get in the way of peaceful protest. And we have to acknowledge, though, that this is a chaotic situation and it hasn't been peaceful protesting. So someone must do something. But I would say that the more constructive way of doing this would be to assess who are the officials, who are the political officials that run these cities and how they let us down. And it's time and time again, Democrats for 50 years running our cities and letting us down. And if you are, a family that lives on the south side of Chicago, you need to ask yourself, who's in charge of this city? And why aren't they doing something to protect my children? How come children are still being shot in Chicago? Who's doing it? Why are my local officials doing nothing? And the answer is, frankly, Democrats have done nothing for our cities for 50 years, and the people who live in our cities need to make a reassessment of who's been in charge of our cities. The only question I'd like to finish with would be the idea of police powers, and that police powers primarily should reside within the states and not the federal government. Do you have a comment on that?
Senator, I would say that, again, Federal Protective Service, through laws that Congress has passed, have given them specific authorities to protect federal facilities. Now, when we talk about everywhere else in the country outside of Portland, any arrests that need to be made because there are individuals perhaps targeting or committing violence against those federal facilities are usually done by state and local law enforcement. So I would agree with you. That's who needs to arrest these individuals and work with the U.S. Attorney to charge those individuals. Unfortunately, for 60 days in Portland, we did not see that occur. No one was holding these individuals accountable. Night after night, they would do their violent acts. No one would hold them accountable. The DHS was put into a position that we had to start making arrests. We had to hold these individuals accountable. As I indicated at the top, 99 federal arrests thus far in Portland. All of those have either taken place on federal property or within 1 to 2 to 3 blocks of that federal property. There seems to be a misconception that we're somehow, across the city, policing the city. That is not the case. We are only targeting individuals that we see, that we know, and that we track take violent activities and criminal activities against that courthouse.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, Acting Secretary Wolf. Would you please convey and know that our thoughts and prayers are with the families of any officers injured in any of these attacks that were going on, and let them know that we're thinking about them at this time. But I do want to talk like everyone else about domestic terrorism, because this week we marked 1 year since the horrific terrorist attack in El Paso, in which 23 Americans lost their lives after a white supremacist targeted the city's Latino community in a deadly rampage. According to the FBI, white supremacists are the nation's most significant domestic threat. Statistics show that racially motivated violent extremism accounts for the majority of all domestic terrorist acts since 1994. Unfortunately, instead of addressing the root causes of white supremacist violence, this administration is using the domestic terrorism label to crack down on peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment rights. To justify the presence of federal law enforcement in Portland, Acting Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli and other DHS officials have accused demonstrators, made up largely of students, veterans, mothers, nurses, and other Americans crying out for racial justice, of terrorism. President Trump has referred to his fellow Americans as a beehive of terrorists. Branding peaceful terrorists, peaceful protesters as terrorists is a tactic commonly used in autocratic societies, not in democracies. Politicizing domestic terrorism distracts from DHS's mission to keep Americans safe from violent extremism, whether it's violence targeting the Latino community in El Paso, the Jewish community at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or any other Americans. So, just yes or no, Acting Secretary Wolf, because our time is limited, do you agree with the FBI's assessment that the top threat we face from domestic terrorists stems from racially motivated violent extremists, particularly white supremacists?
Yes, Senator. What I would agree with, and I have been on record in our strategy back in September of 2019, does support a growing threat from domestic individuals here in the U.S., to include white supremacist extremism growing here. We see the number of incidents rising. And again, as I outlined to a question, I believe, from the ranking member, the department has taken a number of initiatives to address that. Let me just comment really briefly on a comment that you made that I strongly disagree with. DHS law enforcement in no way is cracking down on peaceful protesters in Portland. That is not accurate.
I'd like to claim my time back and follow up on ranking members Peter's question. Thank you. This administration has gutted DHS budget to combat domestic terrorism, including by closing offices and cutting programs. Does the department have the resources it needs to prevent white supremacists from escalating their hateful rhetoric into violence?
Yes, and again, we have actually increased the number of funding to our grant program for targeted terrorism, targeted violence and terrorism prevention. We have a number of individuals dedicated to this mission. And I will just say that from DHS's perspective, we don't investigate these. Obviously, that's the Department of Justice. What we do is training, information sharing, and outreach to different communities to make sure that they have the resources they need to do to respond to this. The department is doing that. We're doing that in a fulsome way. We have a grant program that's going out. We've increased the number of staff in that office, and we are implementing responded to the ranking member on our strategy to address all forms of violent extremism.
That's good to hear. Can you tell us about the amount of dollars that you spent sending federal law enforcement agents to Portland that could have otherwise gone to combating violent extremism across our country? You know, have an estimate on that cost?
Sure. I don't have the specific dollar figure and our assets being deployed to Portland. Again, we deployed assets to Portland because a federal courthouse was being set on fire every night.
Could you supply that budget for us? What was spent on that, please?
We will certainly provide that to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I want to move now to talk a little bit about DACA. You know, while you send law enforcement to major American cities without the consent of state and local leaders, in the background, DHS is you're taking steps that's going to harm our dreamers, hundreds of thousands of them nationwide. You know, in Nevada, we're home to 13,000 DACA recipients. Our dreamers are our friends, our neighbors, students, colleagues, small business owners, first responders, our medical professionals. In some cases, they contribute to our community every single day. And the U.S. Supreme Court recently sided against the administration in its quest to end the DACA program, concluding that its termination of DACA was arbitrary and capricious, and declaring that the matter be remanded to DHS so it may consider the problem anew. In other words, you, as acting DHS Secretary, have the power by choice to protect Dreamers by preventing the DACA program from being terminated. However, in a July 28 memo, you stated you were making changes to DACA and directed DHS personnel, and I quote, to take all appropriate actions to reject all pending and future initial requests for DACA, to reject all pending and future applications for advanced parole absent exceptional circumstances, and to shorten DACA renewals, end quote. This memo clearly ignores the U.S. Supreme Court's decision requiring for the U.S. citizen USCIS to continue to accept and process DACA renewal applications. But you went on saying, I'm going to quote again, I have concluded that the DACA policy at a minimum presents serious policy concerns that may warrant its full rescission, unquote. Again, the decision to pursue rescission of DACA program lies in your hands, and I urge you to consider how your actions to rescind the DACA program will adversely affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 200,000 DACA recipients have been working in areas that DHS identifies as part of the essential critical workforce infrastructure. 41,000 DACA recipients working in the healthcare, physicians, nurses, paramedics, and the like. So please consider reviewing this and allowing these first responders, people on the first line, to continue to serve this nation. Thank you. My time is up.
Mr. Secretary Wolf, you want to respond to something Senator Rosen, I'll give you a minute if you want to do so.
So the Supreme Court decision, obviously, that we are adhering to, that's why I put out the new memo, that's why we're taking certain actions. In no way did the Supreme Court decision tell the department to process new DACA applicants. The Supreme Court decision did not even say that the program was lawful. What it clearly did say is that DHS has the authority to rescind it. Now, of course, it didn't like the way that we had done that over the past 3 years. So my memo that I signed out and the direction I've given to the department is to continue the program under certain parameters. As the senator said, no new DACA applicants or applications are being received, and that we have limited renewals to 1 year. We did that because we have ongoing serious concerns about this program that we are working through consideration based off of the Supreme Court decision and guidance. We're going to work through that carefully. We're going to consider everything that the court laid out. But what we didn't want to do is to continue to operate a program that has serious reservations, unlawful, goes against deferred action, goes against Congress's wishes. And as we do that, we'll continue to process and renew applicants as we have done over the past 3 years.
Okay, that's responding to the last point she made. Was there something else she made a statement that you wanted to respond to?
Again, there were several. One was the DHS law enforcement officials are cracking down on peaceful protesters in Portland. And that's a false narrative. It's a narrative that continues to be put out there. And it does a disservice to the men and women of law enforcement at the department. is doing. In no way are we, doing anything regarding peaceful protest. I've said this time and time again. We see hours-long peaceful protesting that occurs in Portland every night, right across from the Hatfield Courthouse. There's no incidents, there's no arrests, there's no injuries. That is not what is occurring. That's not what our law enforcement officials are dealing with every night.
Okay, thank you. Senator Langford.
Secretary, thanks for your work. Please pass on our gratitude to the men and women of law enforcement that serve with you around the country, especially those that are serving in Portland right now. I am astounded at some of the conversation that I've heard even during this hearing, but most certainly over the past several weeks about the men and women that are serving there every single night. Please tell their families thank you. They are sending out their loved ones to be able to travel to Portland. And as we discussed peaceful protests across the street, your law enforcement have had 277 injuries. So while folks here want to blame the police, please tell them thank you. They've suffered chemical burns, being hit with bricks, being shot with pellet guns, had large-scale fireworks fired sideways into them and mortar rounds. They've had laser pointers shot at their eyes so they lose their sight. While members of this committee talk about peaceful protests and about your law enforcement being the problem. I don't think your agents are the problem. I think they're defending federal property, which is what this Congress originally told them to do. This whole focus on defund the police and just walk away like they did in Minneapolis and just allow the building to burn down and allow rioters to burn it down, saying that's better, I do not agree with, and millions of other Americans don't agree with, just consenting to rioters to burn things down. So for your men and women that are on the front lines, please tell them thank you. That we are exceptionally grateful for their work, and I do not believe that they are the problem. Nor do I think that, as has been stated over and over again, and even in this hearing, well, I know that they've been shot at, and that they've had bricks thrown at them, and that they've had mortar rounds fired at them, and that they've had trash set on fire and leaf blowers blowing the trash towards them. But hey, there's two sides to the story. Just please tell them thank you from me. I do want to ask you a whole series of questions, and I've got a lot of them. So let me just kind of walk through this. I've heard over and over again that your federal law enforcement are going out on the streets and harming peaceful protesters. Are you cracking down on peaceful protests?
Absolutely not.
Your federal agents are being accused over and over again as saying they're not marked as police, they're just unmarked, wandering the streets, and they have no police markings. Do you have federal law enforcement in Portland that are not labeled as police on their uniform?
Absolutely not. We are a uniform department. We have 9 operating agencies. They all wear different uniforms. All of the uniforms, as you can see here, are marked with marked with police. Some say Homeland Security, others say Border Patrol, others say CBP, and others say ICE. They have police on the front, they have police on the back, they have patches on their shoulders. They clearly identify themselves as police. And I will just say, these are the individuals who are out there in this. It's essentially a half a square block where most of this violence takes place. They're out there for 66 nights. After the 40th night, you know who they are. You know violence is taking place at this spot each and every night. And you know if you come there, that's what you're coming to do.
So it's also been accused they're not wearing their name tags. So tell me a little bit about that.
They're not wearing their name tags because of the doxing that we have seen for a number of agents. Not only their personal information is put out on Twitter or social media, but individuals are showing up at their homes and that their families are being identified. So what we did is we pulled off of their name tags, and John Smith pulled that off. We did put a unique identifier and implement numbers and letters on their uniforms. We could keep track of them, the accountability for them, but their name is not specifically on there.
Thank you very much for that. I have heard over and over again, these are folks that are out there that are not trained in de-escalation. They've been randomly pulled in from other places, and they're actually causing the violence by escalating because they're not trained.
Right, so not true. So our Federal Protective Service officers are there. They are trained specifically for this mission. The ICE and the CBP officials that we have, law enforcement officials, are specifically trained for this mission. Our BORTAC unit from CBP, this is what they do at ports of entry. Ports of entry every day, or I would say over the course of years, there are mass protests. Some try to barricade themselves at ports of entry. This what we do. These are the individuals that we sent to Portland. I did not send law enforcement and the Coast Guard or TSA or anyone else to Portland. They are not trained. It would not have been appropriate for them to be there.
I've heard over and over again that federal agents are wandering the streets of Portland, arresting people randomly. Snatch and grab is what I'm hearing from my Democratic colleagues, that they're just out there unlabeled, unmarked, grabbing people off the streets and putting them in unmarked cars.
So again, not true. We do have marked and unmarked vehicles. Again, what we try to do is de-escalate the situation. So as an individual is throwing a Molotov cocktail at the federal courthouse, they then disappear into a group of 500 to 1,000 or 2,000 individuals. What we don't do is try to go into the middle of that group. That's dangerous for our law enforcement officers and others. What we try to do is to keep track of that individual and then begin to question that individual or arrest that individual when he breaks away from a group. So it de-escalates the situation. We've done all of our arrests, all 99 arrests that I talked to you earlier, happened on federal property or within 2 to 3 blocks of that federal courthouse.
So I've also heard over and over again you're not cooperating with the local law enforcement or the local officials, and they are depicted by Democrats on this committee as Oregon just so cooperative and they've been so helpful and friendly. You just not reached out to them. But yet, as I go through your report, the day when the Portland City Council voted to prohibit their law enforcement, local law enforcement, from cooperating with you, engaging with you, any kind of sharing of information, the day that they voted for that. This was your report from the night before in that time period that DHS put out. The report was around 10:20 local time, violent anarchists began the nightly assault on the courthouse. Rioters began to barricade in front of the courthouse, assaulted officers inside of the courthouse with lasers, which can cause permanent blindness. After repeated attack from rioters, the plywood coverings at the front of the courthouse began to buckle. A group of rioters vandalized the south entrance of the courthouse with spray paint. In response to the rioters' assault, federal officers were forced to leave the building because they'd been inside in order to repel the mob. When they did so, they were immediately assaulted with lasers and a variety of objects designed to inflict harm. Crowd control measures were deployed to try to redirect a large amount of people in the courthouse vicinity. Rioters responded by using cars to block movement on the street. Rioters began to use wooden boards to block the main courthouse entrance with officers inside. They hurled projectiles in front of the courthouse and charged the doors. And then also this story as well, that in the early morning hours of July 22nd, that's the day of the vote, when they said for police not to cooperate with you, a group of individuals gathered in an exterior entry in the Hatfield Federal Courthouse. Several members of the group, including Mr. Mazza, began removing plywood attached to the front of the building to protect the damaged glass facade. After the group successfully removed the plywood sheeting, Mr. Mazza made multiple attempts to kick in the window, struck it with a metal object, repeatedly pounded on it what appeared to be a hammer. Shortly thereafter, a number of people successfully removed the entire wooden structure protecting the courthouse entry, and an unknown individual broke one of the windows. After this breach, Mazza walked towards the building carrying a cylindrical object, then appeared to light a fuse, connected to the object, placed it inside the broken window. A short time later, the object exploded in close proximity to law enforcement officers exiting the building through a broken window, and the injuries were sustained. That was the night before Portland voted to law enforcement wouldn't cooperate with you, and the night after night after night. These are the peaceful protests that are occurring as members of this committee continue to blame your officers as the problem when that's actually happening on the street. So thanks for clarifying what the news is not reporting, and just tell your folks thank you for standing up for what's good and right.
Thank you for that clarifying line of question, Senator Langford. Senator Romney. I don't see him on the board here anymore. I'll go to Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congress and this committee in particular has a responsibility, of course, to ensure that the Census Bureau completes a full and accurate 2020 census free from political interference. Yet in the last week, the administration made clear that it is overriding Census Bureau professionals by forcing them to rush by 1 month remaining census operations, regardless of the quality and the accuracy of that data. This political interference, if not checked by Congress, will harm hard-to-count communities, including rural communities, communities of color, tribal nations, and low-income communities for the next decade at least. So, Chairman, I urge you to schedule a hearing on this topic because, of course, we have a duty to ensure a fair and accurate census.
We've already reached out, so again, we're going to probably leave sessions here. I'm not sure when a hearing would be scheduled, but I've already reached out to the department.
I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, on August 3rd, the Washington Post reported that you regularly talk with the President and Stephen Miller. Have you discussed the deployment of DHS agents to protests in connection with the President's re-election effort and with the President or any of his staff, White House staff, or campaign staff?
And I'm not going to comment on my discussions with the President or senior staff. All the events that have taken place in Portland or the events as it with respect
Sir,
to
have you
Operation
discussed
Legend,
the deployment with any of his campaign staff?
No, have all been at the direction of the department.
I'm not sure if I heard your answer. Have you discussed the deployments with any of the President's campaign staff?
No.
And has the party affiliation of particular mayors or governors come up in any of your conversations with anyone about the deployments?
Not in my conversation.
Are you aware of any conversations that have addressed that?
Again, I'm not going to comment on any specific conversations that I have with the President.
So you're not going to comment on whether the party affiliation of the mayors or governors has come up in any of your conversations?
Not in my, general statement, because I see where you're going, is I'm not going to comment specifically on any discussions that I've had with the President or senior staff. What I can tell you is our deployment of law enforcement officers for Portland or in support of Operation Legend are done within DHS authorities and not for any political specific reasons.
On July 23rd, a United States Federal District Court judge ordered DHS and U.S. Marshals to stop arresting, threatening, or using force against journalists and legal observers. I'm assuming that you were aware of that ruling on the day it came down.
Yes.
Can you tell this committee what you did to inform your agents about that ruling and what exactly did you inform them? And when did you inform them?
It was of that evening, I believe. I believe that came down in the afternoon. We worked with our Office of General Counsel along with the Department of Justice to make sure that our officers there in Portland specifically were aware of that, provided some additional training along with FPS, and I believe DOJ did the same with the U.S. Marshals.
By what method did you inform your agents in Portland that day or that evening?
OGC, our Office of General Counsel back at headquarters, liaison with a lawyer there in Portland, and then briefed out all of our law enforcement operators there.
Did you issue a memorandum to your agents that evening?
I believe that the individual component heads from FPS and OGC, which would normally do that, our Office of General Counsel, provided not only the verbal briefing but also in paper.
Is that your normal protocol that you as the Secretary of this agency would not directly inform your agents who are on the ground of a court ruling regarding the parameters and the permissible parameters of their enforcement?
But the normal protocol would make sure that our Office of General Counsel, our General Counsel would inform them, and then the individual operating heads, component heads of those additional law enforcement agencies would inform them as well.
The next day on July 24th, a Californian who was a law student studying in Portland attended the protest. She was wearing a green hat, identifying her as a legal observer. She was filming the protest when a federal agent shot her with a rubber bullet near her heart at point-blank range. Was there any disciplinary action taken against that agent?
I'm unaware of that specific instance. What I can say is no DHS law enforcement officers in Portland used rubber bullets.
You have not been informed of this in any manner, even through the news?
Not of that specific one. Again, DHS law enforcement officers do not use that type of less than lethal munitions.
Will you follow up, please, with this committee and ask your staff if they are familiar with this case?
Well, again,
and if that was a DHS
U.S. Marshals.
Sir, may I finish, please? And will you answer to this committee, once you have checked with your staff, if they are familiar with this incident, and if it was one of your agents, was there any disciplinary action taken?
Again, I
follow up the committee?
Just answered, it was not one of our agents. We do not use that type of less than lethal munitions.
Public reports show federal agents using chemicals against mothers and veterans. Agents are also using military-style flashbangs that explode almost like a bomb and make people feel they are going to death. Have you consulted with medical experts about the impact of chemical irritants irritants on protesters, including pregnant women?
We have looked at a variety of our less than lethal munitions as it regards to crowd control and dispersing crowds.
Have you checked with medical experts about the impact of those chemical irritants on pregnant women?
Not on pregnant women, I have not.
I would advise you to do that.
Again, the
Have any
less than
DHS
lethal munitions that we use in Portland occur between midnight and 5 a.m. every night.
Sir, I would advise you, knowing there are women, including pregnant women, in these protests, I would advise you, knowing, that, and it is well known, there are mothers, including pregnant women, who are attending these protests. I would advise you, sir, to consult with medical experts to determine the impact of chemical irritants on pregnant women. Moving on, have any DHS personnel been suspended, terminated, or otherwise disciplined for using excessive force at the protests?
Are you referring to Portland specifically?
Any protests?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Have there been any complaints that have been investigated by your agency?
I know that our office of CRCL, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, has received a number of complaints.
And what is the protocol that you have for being personally informed of those complaints and the investigations, if any, have taken place?
CRCL, as I know, is looking into them. We have the DHS OIG is also looking, has an open investigation as well.
And at what point does it come to you?
It would come to me after the investigation is complete.
My time is up. Thank you, sir.
Senator Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Can we just start by, is it your estimation that the riots that have been occurring in Portland around the federal courthouse are coordinated and organized operations against federal property and law enforcement?
We have seen certainly some coordination involved there and organization in there. Some of the tactics that they use are very similar to law enforcement as well as military.
Why do you believe that the rioters have chosen, the violent rioters, we're now talking about the ones who are firing munitions, who are attacking federal officers, who are doxing federal law enforcement? Why is it that they've chosen to target a federal courthouse? Is there some symbolism here?
I'm not sure because it's interesting because, you know, it's obviously the seat of justice there in Portland. A lot of lawsuits that I'm sure some of the individuals that are peacefully protesting that want to see some changes in law enforcement are taking place in this courthouse. What we see on the side of the courthouse is, you know, they want to burn it down there. They're very, very specific about that. They're on social media about that. Again, what I would say is night after night, for 60 nights, someone showing up at 3 a.m. on a site that has been very violent night after night, not a peaceful protester, not a mother that wants to peacefully protest at that courthouse. They are showing up for a reason at 3 a.m. That's to do damage to the courthouse or our office.
You've been to Portland yourself, haven't you?
Yeah.
You've been on the ground, you've seen the situation. What are the law enforcement officers who are there on the ground protecting this property? What have they told you, and what do you think that they might like this committee to know?
They are, my DHS law enforcement officers who I met with when I was there are extremely frustrated, or they were, I would say before Oregon State Police got involved. They are extremely frustrated. They are a target each and every night. They are in a courthouse, and you have these violent individuals that are staging in city parks, on city streets, coming out of various directions. They know which entrances we come in and out of that courthouse at. They have a target, and it's very specific. So they feel under attack each and every night, and they were looking for state and local law enforcement to step up, patrol their parks, patrol their streets, and make arrests.
Let's talk a little bit about the doxing. You referenced this, and just to give us a better idea of what's going on. I understand that at least 38 law enforcement officers in Portland, federal law enforcement officers, were doxed, meaning that their personal information, including perhaps where they lived, their personal residence, was made publicly available. I think we can all agree that this is the worst form of sort of a public, it's really a form of social terrorism in a way, to try and get these folks, put them in danger, put their families in danger, discourage them from undertaking their responsibilities. Can you describe for us in more detail what happened in that instance and who you was responsible?
Yeah, what we see, again, open source reporting is information that's put out on Twitter or on message boards that are identified by violent individuals that are taking place in Portland. It's exposing their personal information. It's not only those individuals, it's also the individuals that we have brought in, where they're staying, certain hotels that they're staying at are being put out on social media. We see them and we've had to beef up security around those hotels as well. So it's very dangerous. It's just as dangerous as being in that courthouse. Once they leave, their danger doesn't go away. The threat doesn't go away from them. So individuals that we have there, night after night after night, not only having to fight the fight between midnight and 5 a.m., and also when they leave to go back to their hotel units.
And you just referenced this in terms of what you're doing at the hotel. Give me some sense of what measures DHS is taking to protect both the officers who have been doxxed and then others who are there serving, carrying out their responsibilities, trying to keep federal property and citizens, law-abiding citizens safe. What are you doing to protect them and their families?
Each of our law enforcement agencies, whether it's FDS, whether it's ICE or CBP, certainly have protocols that are put in place once a law enforcement officer's information is put out on social media. So making sure that we can pull that down as much as possible. Once it's out, it's very helpful to do that. But making sure that they are protected as well. We have a chief security office at the department that obviously looks into all of this as well. So we're doing our very best. Now, while they're there at the courthouse, they're very safe, they're very secure. We make sure of that. They come in well before any of the violent rioting starts, and then they'll stay at that courthouse until it's done.
Just one final question on this, on the Portland situation. It's my understanding, and I think you referenced this a moment ago, that the Homeland Security Act of 2002 actually charges the Homeland Security Secretary with protecting federal buildings and grounds. I mean, that's a statute passed by this body, by the United States Congress, and that there is therefore a legal obligation for you to undertake the protection of federal property. Can you just elaborate on that?
No, it's absolutely right. 40 U.S.C. 1315 directs the department, directs the secretary, and then FDS as an extension to protect federal property. And I think a lot has been made about us sending additional law enforcement. What we saw in 2014, Secretary Johnson, DHS Secretary, sent additional law enforcement to FDS sites across this country as the threat warranted. The threat warranted it, in this case, is law enforcement, and that's what we did.
I want to, just in my remaining time here, talk a little bit about the Operation Legend, which is happening across the United States. DHS is involved with that. It began in my home state and in the city of Kansas City, where a young boy, 4-year-old, Legend Telefaro, was killed by gunfire while he slept in the early morning of June the 29th. Can you just elaborate for us on DHS's role in Operation Legend?
Sure. We are supporting the Department of Justice, mainly through our Homeland Security investigators, as are our HSI agents, part of ICE. And that's what they do each and every day. They are looking at transnational criminal gangs, they're looking at illicit narcotics, they're looking at all of the violent street crime that we see is on the rise in many of these metropolitan cities. So in Chicago, we have over 100 HSI agents that are there every day focusing on this. And what we're doing is we're prioritizing the cases that they work on to make sure that we address, in partnership with ATF, DEA, FBI, Marshal Service, making sure that we're coming at it as a team, as a federal team, along with state and locals there to address that.
Now, I've had several conversations with the Department of Justice about Operation Legend as it's unfolded and continues to unfold. My understanding is that this operation is designed to assist state and local leaders in protecting their citizens, also in prosecuting crimes. Of course, oftentimes, I can say as a former state prosecutor, that the crime can be duly charged at state and federal level. I can say, as a former state law enforcement official, that we always welcome federal assistance. But is it your understanding that this operation is designed to assist state and local leaders? And how would you assess so far the coordination and communication between state and local leaders, and at least what you're seeing at DHS?
It's certainly designed that way, and I think it's working very well. So we've seen it work in Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, and a number of other cities. And I think what you see is mayors and other elected officials in those cities, once they understand what it is, once they understand that we're there to work with them, designed to go after some of the violent crime, you see them saying, great, I welcome you into my city. I want you to work with us.
Very good. My time's expired. I just want to say in conclusion, thank you to the DHS law enforcement officers. Thank you to you, Mr. Secretary, for your service, but thank you especially to those law enforcement officers who are out there putting their lives on the line. I know that they don't have to do that. They're choosing to serve in this way. They're choosing to go out and to try and keep safe American citizens, federal property, just like the Capitol Police do every single day in this building, just like the law enforcement do at home, who keep us safe. So as someone who had the privilege as the Attorney General of my state to work with law enforcement in my state every single day, I just want to say thank you to them for what they're doing and for choosing to serve our country in this way. And I'm sorry that they are being dragged through the mud as they are.
Thank you. I'll pass that along.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper. Tom, you're up. Can you unmute?
Good afternoon.
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us. Long before I came to the U.S. Secretary, I was a Boy Scout. I was a Silver Air Patrol cadet. I was a midshipman. I was an English flight officer. Today's the last Vietnam veteran still serving in the U.S. Senate with John McCain. One of the people I served with later on when I was elected to the U.S. Congress was a guy named Tom Ridge. And Tom Ridge also served as a Vietnam veteran, and we served together in Congress. We served together in government. I ended up in the U.S. Senate on the Homeland Security Committee, and he ended up as Secretary of Homeland Security, and he was and remains one of my dearest friends. I'm sure he's a lifelong friend. He's a lifelong friend for me. He was quoted recently as saying, we'll just read what he said. Again, he was Secretary of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration. He says, quote, "You may have statutory authority to do certain things, but that doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. The insertion of a SWAT team like this did not diffuse the situation exacerbated. Went on to say the department was established to protect America from the ever-present threat of global terrorism was not established to be the president's personal militia. And he added, it would be a cold day in hell before I would consent to uninvited unilateral intervention into one of my cities." Close quote. When he was governor of Pennsylvania, were governors at the same time. He and I took an oath, and this is a copy of the Constitution. He took an oath to defend the country and the Constitution. And the First Amendment of the Constitution says that Congress shall make no law respecting the exercise of religion, but in the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people, peaceably to assemble, and petition the government for redress of grievances. Kind of activity that occurred in the United States this morning in Portland, apparently for days, nights, and 2 weeks on end, it was not peaceful assembly. And I think it's not the kind of behavior that any of us would want. When I was chairman several years ago, my colleagues may recall, I was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. I would go to the floor of the Senate every month. I would talk about a different piece, a different part of the Department of Homeland Security, could be Border Patrol, it could be TSA, it could be Coast Guard, it could be a variety of things. And I would talk about their mission and thank the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security for their service to our country. And thank their families for sharing their husbands, their wives, moms, and dads for the people of America. So I understand their problem, I understand the challenges, the main challenges on the basis. And I don't count this the occasions of the incidents in which the men in the department were deployed behave to battle, but that certainly doesn't excuse the behavior of those who up at 2 in the morning and violently demonstrate. My office was actually at the Wilmington Federal Courthouse. During about a month or so ago, when violence popped up all over many parts of the country, there were violent protesters in the late hours of the that morning. We came right down King Street, right in front of the federal building, where I used to tour. And along with Joe Biden's office was there, and the office was there, all the judges' offices were there. And our federal building was lined out. Last and that's over a month ago. What happened in the hours is that was a remarkable thing, and what happened is the chief of police, one of the police department, Robert Tracy, who's a veteran of services in New York City Police, Chicago Police, he and our mayor, Mike Persicki, met with demonstrators and on their own turf, and just positive. and began a communications that ended up diffusing violence to that weekend, and the next week and the week after that, in his mind again. The great Parliament movie called, I used to call it, it was called, I had that wrong, the great Parliament movie where Jews ended up in prison, escaped from the prison, and he was tracked down, and the great line that the prison wardens that said that they finally got home in the back, put in jail, said that what we had was a failure to communicate. And I think what we had right here in court was a failure to communicate. I used to be chairman of the National Governors Association. But yes, every president had from the legislature like you and their own despite. And every president I've known literally has the ability to communicate without the egos and then keeps on versus any basis in that in the public. And the idea that we face a situation like this, and the president never puts it on as far as I don't, can call the governor or the mayor of this is just not acceptable. What can we do to help? How can we help make sure that this kind of violence is stopped? And to be invited into to make that a huge deal. I don't use this out there. I asked my dad, I said, what's going on now that the federal law has been stepping on what's going on in terms of violence? What I have on DHS's own website, which was August 2nd, is protest activity continues its overall trend. Diminishing violence as a result of the increases in cooperation between the state and federal law enforcement. In stark contrast to the enhanced violence in Portland over the past 2 months. I don't want to cry over this, don't know if we could do this all over again. The idea of the President of the United States in the first way communicating with the governor of the mayor of Portland, it would be all of this, and it could be all of this. It's taken a long time. I apologize for that. Mr. Chairman, if you might allow the Secretary to speak for a minute or so, I believe.
So you can respond, sure.
Well, thank you, Senator. Apologies, it was a little difficult to hear, but let me take a couple of those comments and questions in order here. I appreciate you holding up the Constitution. That's exactly what the men and women, the law enforcement officers of DHS defend every day of the ideals in that Constitution, to include the First Amendment. As I've said here, we both support and defend individuals who are going to peacefully protest, but again, what we see in Portland is absolutely the opposite between midnight and 5 a.m. for 60 days straight. So I just want to be very clear on that. Regarding Portland and a failure to communicate, I would disagree. There's been no failure to communicate. We've been very, very clear on what we need from state and local officials and law enforcement. For 60 days, they refused to engage. Finally, the governor reached out, and now you see Oregon State Police patrolling the streets, patrolling along with Portland Police around that federal courthouse. And guess what? The violence has stopped. We knew it would stop once you have local, state, and local law enforcement engaging and doing their job. We knew the violence would decrease, and it has. Unfortunately, it took till day 60. It should have occurred on day 2 or 3. So that's unfortunate. And then regarding the comment on former Secretary Ridge, former Secretary Chertoff has also been mentioned here. And what I will again respectfully say is that I appreciate their service not only to the department, to the country, but again, they are wrong on this issue. They do not understand the situation that is occurring in Portland. They don't understand the facts on the ground. And as I talked to them, I did reach out, and I talked to them and explained that. They understood what the men and women of DHS law enforcement, and their response was, you've got to work better with state and local. I agree with you. I agree with them. We have to work better with state and local. We need a willing partner in order to work with them. And for 60 days, we did not have a willing partner to work with us.
Mr. Chairman, I just respond. There's a lot to be said. When I was privileged to be chief executive of my state, I would pick up the phone and call people.
I did. I called both the governor and the mayor.
And I would just hope that not just the secretary would reach out, but in a case like this, I think it's good for the president to do that. And maybe have the kind of relationships where, I just talk to the mayor, but maybe actually by communicating, find a way to diffuse this and figure out whose role is to be better served. Thank you.
does take two to tango. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chairman and the ranking member holding this hearing today, and especially the diligent effort to ensure that members can participate remotely. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. The Senate should set a good example regarding the importance of social distancing and making smart decisions during this pandemic, especially as an increasing number of members of Congress and Council staff are diagnosed with COVID-19. So we're doing that today. I also appreciate Acting Secretary Wolf joining us today. Second, Acting Secretary, my colleagues discussed the challenges we saw in Portland regarding communication between DHS and state and local officials. It's vitally important that this communication is frequent, open, honest, and flows in both directions. I share the concerns my colleagues have expressed on these matters. Will you follow up with me in my office regarding how DHS intends to improve its partnerships with state, local, and tribal officials and improve its communication strategies to prevent the types of challenges that we saw in Portland?
I will, Senator, and I will say that, again, we don't have any other issue in any other city around the country. It's very specific to Portland. I continue to reach out to both the mayor and the governor, but again, I would direct you to the Portland City Council passed a resolution that prohibited Portland police from coordinating, supporting, and sharing information with federal law enforcement.
Thank you. Unfortunately, there are additional situations where DHS is not successfully communicated with state, local, and tribal officials. I continue to be very troubled by the recent reports that ICE house migrant children, in many cases very young children, in temporary hotel accommodations in Arizona while deportation flights to their home countries were arranged. DHS did not notify the City of Phoenix about this initiative, and as we're aware, the City of Phoenix does not have a similar type of resolution passed, and we are willing and able to communicate with DHS clients. So we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and communication across all levels of government is vital to maintaining a coordinated and strategic response. Frequent and robust communication between federal, local, and state officials is both important to ensure law enforcement infliction efforts and a coordinated message, and it's also critical to protecting the public health in individual states and communities. So my question for you, Acting Secretary Wolf, is why did DHS choose not to communicate with the City of Phoenix in advance of this initiative? And what specific steps have you taken to improve communication with appropriate local officials regarding the transport and detention of children in DHS custody, especially when children are not being held in traditional DHS facilities?
Well, our use, or ICE's use specifically of hotel housing accommodations have been ongoing for decades, so it's nothing new. So we do that because ORR is not able to take those unaccompanied alien children at that specific time, or another housing location, ICE facility is not readily available because of the part of the country, or as you indicated, they are being deported the very next day. So this is a practice that the department has used going back again for decades. The communication, though, I will say, should be occurring there locally in Arizona, specifically both with the ICE director there as well as the CBP official, making sure that there is close coordination as those individuals are either being moved out of the hotel accommodations and housings, whether they're being deported or they're being moved to ORR for further action.
I appreciate that. I'd like to follow up with you that it happens in the future. As you mentioned, this has been going on for decades, and I think it will continue to occur. In a state like Arizona, where we have high levels of apprehensions and deportations, we want to solve this before it continues. Since the initial report of this situation, the identified hotels have said they will no longer allow migrant children to be held at their properties. So is ICE continuing to hold children in non-ICE facilities now? And if so, where are they being held? And if not, can you tell me where the population of migrant children are being held?
Again, we have contracts that have been going on for decades to house individuals that we are in the process, or in the course of processing. Again, it's a UAC moving those from DHS custody to ORR, HHS custody, or to deport them. And as we do that, and then from a family, we also do that with family units as well. So we do that not only using ICE housing facilities, detention facilities, and we have several of them in Texas and in Arizona, but we also continue to use that with housing accommodations as well.
So are you using additional hotels other than the ones that have said they will no longer accommodate ICE requests to house immigrant children?
Yeah, so we continue to work with local hotels and again with our contractor that mans and supports that. So we continue to use that moving forward. We understand, again, some hotels fall on and off of that contract, and we continue to use that as a way to house the individuals that we are picking up that are legally have no right to remain in the U.S., and we continue to process them.
So if I were to communicate with the mayor of Phoenix, Mayor Gallego, she would be aware of the current situation of migrant children being housed in non-ICE facilities inside the city of Phoenix, including other hotels.
So we can certainly reach out to the mayor and to any other city officials and certainly explain the process, explain how that occurs and what they will see in their communities. And we should certainly be doing that from the ICE director there in Arizona. We can certainly have that outreach take place.
Well, let's follow up on this, because in my last question, we both agreed that this should be happening. And now we know that it is not happening. And since you said that ICE will continue to transport children and hold them in hotel-type facilities in the city of Phoenix, to my knowledge, there has been, as of this moment, no outreach to the city of Phoenix to the mayor's office. So I'd like to follow and make sure that this actually does occur.
Absolutely. And again, as we do our mission each and every day in transporting individuals between DHS custody, HHS custody, and the like, we do that every day. We'll certainly communicate with mayors and local officials as much as we certainly can. But these are missions that we do day in and day out every single day.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time is nearly expired. I do have some additional questions, but also get those to Acting Secretary Wolf. And again, I thank you for holding this hearing today and the accommodation to allow for remote participation. I appreciate it. I yield back my time.
Oh, thanks, Senator Sinema. Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for appearing here. As is often the case, when I reserve my time in terms of questioning, allows the other senators to ask the questions. Most of those questions have already been asked, so I won't repeat them. I think there's just kind of one area that I do want to explore a little bit with you, and it really is the makeup of the rioters. I know Senator Peters, a number of the folks on the other side of the aisle were making a statement in terms of white supremacists, which I think we all acknowledge is a growing problem, and one that I know the department's not ignoring. This committee certainly isn't as well. Do you have any kind of intelligence in terms of the rioters? First of all, is it a coordinated effort? Are you seeing coordination between, some organization and different riots in different cities, or is this just locally spawned, potentially inspired by more of the national movement? What are we finding out in terms of what's causing all this?
So I'll talk specifically about Portland. What we do see in Portland, or what we saw over that 60-day period, was some organization to how they attacked the federal courthouse. And that was just there locally, so I'm not talking about any coordination with other cities. But specifically how they approached the courthouse, the tactics that they used, it was clear that they were trained. It was clear that there was some organization involved there, and it wasn't just this natural outgrowth that, for them to arrive there at 2 a.m. with weapons in hand.
Okay, so there's signs of organization. Have you been able to, with investigation techniques, that type of thing, determine who is organizing?
Yeah, so our Homeland Security investigators are working with specifically the FBI and DOJ. They have a number of cases open specifically regarding Portland. And I think what we're going to see over the course of the next 30 days to a month, you're going to see a lot more activity coming out of the Department of Justice and charging individuals.
So again, you just spoke about Portland, but there are riots, and very destructive riots, all over the country in a number of different cities.
Right.
Without revealing the final findings of the investigations, which obviously you're not ready to do,
right,
are you finding organizing groups? Are you finding commonality in terms of what's happening?
Overall, we are in individual cities. I do not see, or I haven't seen the intelligence that they're coordinating across multiple cities all at the same time. But what we do see, and I've said it time and time again, violent criminals, violent opportunists. These are individuals that perhaps don't have an ideology, but are taking advantage of an environment, specifically in Portland, that for 60 days you could show up and you could do any type of violent things to a courthouse and then you could leave and no repercussions. So violent opportunists. We also see violent anarchists, specifically trying to burn down a courthouse. We see Antifa on social media promulgating and inspiring others to do more violence in Portland, organizing. So there's certainly the Antifa. We also see Boogaloo, and the ranking member mentioned it. That has been attributed there in Portland as well. So we see a number of violent extremists and ideology that is occurring. And what's dangerous about Portland is they have fostered this environment that you can show up, you can do any number of dangerous and criminal acts with no consequence to you. And that's why they showed up night after night on the 30th, 40th, 50th, and 60th night, because they know for the vast majority, until DHS started arresting people, that there was no consequence.
So of the people you've arrested, might be the best in terms of gathering intelligence of what's causing this. My guess, we talked about white supremacy, we talked about Antifa, that's the full spectrum of political ideology. Are you finding the full spectrum? Is there a majority, one side versus the other? Are anarchists, do they have ideology, or are they just simply anarchists for the sake of being an anarchist?
So of the arrests that we've made, it's been almost 199 different federal arrests. We're seeing all of the above that you mentioned and I have mentioned as well. What we are also seeing is that these individuals are trained not to talk to law enforcement. So as soon as they are picked up, as soon as they are arrested, they do not talk to law enforcement. So the intel that we get from them is very, very little. And then obviously we turn it over to the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney there, and then that process plays itself out.
So from past investigations, do you know which groups train people not to talk to law enforcement?
All of the above, anywhere from just anarchists to Antifa and others. But yes, we do see that.
Okay. Well, again, I'm going to find it quite interesting when some of your investigations conclude and we can maybe bring, get some sense, some sort of sense of what's happening here, who's driving all this. Certainly, we saw broad support from this committee to the men and women of your department, and I think that's fitting. I think that's proper. I'm glad to hear the very strong show of support. What I tried to do in my opening statement is lay out the significant challenges the men and women of DHS and in general law enforcement face. It's not an easy task. I tried to describe the sacrifices made. And again, it's not only the sacrifice made by the men and women on the front lines, but it is their family. They have to worry every time their loved one steps out the door, goes to work, and puts their life on the line. I mean, that's what's happening. So certainly from my standpoint, I want to encourage you to convey our appreciation, my appreciation to all law enforcement, particularly those in your department. Again, I mentioned the sacrifice, so please wish the injured a full and speedy recovery.
Absolutely.
And there's something that is particularly evil, which is one of the reasons I put it in the video, the green laser lights. Okay. Broken bones will heal. Other injuries are healed. You lose your sight, you've lost a quality of life. You've lost one of your senses. And for any human being to do that to another human being just strikes me as particularly evil. I hope they stop. I hope they question what is they're doing to another human being. But again,
just on that point, I agree with you 100%. It's why I talk so passionately about our mission in Portland and about our law enforcement officers, and I welcome the opportunity to have discussions like this where I can refute some very inaccurate and dangerous information about DHS law enforcement, because what is occurring in Portland and what's being reported by mainstream media are two different things that are going on. DHS is out there, we're supporting our law enforcement officers, but it certainly helps, Chairman, when you and other members of the committee show that support as well.
I just want Americans to just really consider, let's say that was your father, or your husband, or your wife, that's being confronted by somebody who puts a little hole in their shield, and then hits a laser light to try and blind your loved one. Again, there's just something horribly despicable about all of this, but in particular that one really, it just affects me. So anyway, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. It's not an easy job. Coming before this committee is not an easy task. I think you did a good job of, be very forthright in your testimony, and please convey the strong support to the men and women of your department, of this committee, and also for me personally. So with that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until August 21st at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.